The gallery buzzed with life, a symphony of polished shoes on marble floors, the quiet hum of conversations, and the occasional clink of glasses from an art show reception in the adjoining hall. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting shimmering patterns across the walls adorned with contemporary masterpieces. Wealthy patrons, dressed in tailored suits and designer dresses, wandered from one exhibit to another, pausing only to exchange lofty opinions on the artwork or to nod approvingly at one another. In the midst of this polished scene, the gallery owner, a sharp-dressed man in his early 40s with slicked-back hair, moved through the crowd like a maestro conducting an orchestra. His presence was magnetic, his tone authoritative, and his demeanor exuded an air of superiority. He reveled in his role as the gatekeeper of culture, the arbiter of taste, and, above all, the man in control. Then, almost unnoticed at first, a figure entered the gallery, a man who did not fit the mold of the usual clientele. He was elderly, his skin weathered like a well-traveled map, his gait measured but firm. He wore a plain, well-worn jacket over a button-up shirt, paired with khakis that had seen better days. His shoes, polished but scuffed, carried the marks of countless miles walked. A simple cap rested on his head, emblazoned with a faded insignia that read Vietnam Veteran. His presence seemed to shift the air in the room, though not in a way that commanded respect. Instead, it sparked whispers and furtive glances. A few patrons quickly stepped aside as though his proximity might tarnish their curated image. One of the younger staff members behind the counter nudged a colleague and muttered something under her breath, stifling a laugh. The gallery owner noticed the man as well. His sharp eyes scanned him from head to toe, and a faint sneer curled his lips. With a quick glance at his staff, he made no effort to hide his disdain. To him, the man was a distraction, an anomaly in his pristine sanctuary of high art. "Excuse me, sir," the owner said, approaching the man with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This is a private gallery. May I ask if you're here to purchase something?" The man looked up, his eyes calm yet piercing. "I'm here to look at the art," he said in a steady voice, his hands resting lightly on the walking stick he carried. The owner's smile tightened. "Of course, but you see, we specialize in exclusive pieces here, works that might not be in everyone's range. Perhaps there's a more, let's say, accessible gallery down the street that might suit you better." Several patrons chuckled softly, and the staff exchanged amused glances. The elderly man didn't react. He simply nodded, his gaze drifting past the owner to the artwork on the walls. It was as though he was already elsewhere, focused entirely on the pieces before him. This indifference only seemed to irritate the owner further. "Well," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "if you insist on staying, please be mindful of where you walk. Some of these pieces are worth more than most people earn in a lifetime." At this, a young woman standing nearby shifted uncomfortably. She watched the elderly man closely, her expression a mix of curiosity and unease. There was something about his demeanor, his quiet confidence, his unshaken calm, that seemed out of place amid the judgment and ridicule. As the gallery owner turned away, muttering something to a staff member about security, the elderly man continued his slow walk through the gallery. He paused before a striking piece, a large canvas bursting with color and emotion. His fingers brushed his chin thoughtfully as he studied the work, his expression softening. What no one in the room realized was that this man was no ordinary visitor. Beneath his humble exterior lay a lifetime of experiences, both harrowing and triumphant. He was not merely a man in tattered clothes. He was a Vietnam War veteran, a man who had faced battles far more treacherous than the subtle snobbery of an art gallery. He had endured the unthinkable, built a life from the ashes of hardship, and had, over the years, cultivated a love for art that few could match. But for now, he said nothing. He let their assumptions play out, watching as the gallery owner and his staff revealed their true colors. Little did they know, the man they dismissed so easily would soon reveal a side of himself that would leave them all speechless. For behind those weathered eyes and that unassuming presence was a story, and a fortune, that would change everything: the dismissal, gallery owner's rude behavior. The elderly man continued to move through the gallery with an unhurried grace, pausing thoughtfully before each piece of art. His eyes, sharp yet kind, lingered on the brushstrokes, the intricate details that told stories within the frames. It was evident to anyone paying attention that this man wasn't a casual observer. He studied the artwork with the reverence of someone who understood its depth and nuance. But, to the gallery owner and his staff, his appearance told an entirely different story. The gallery owner, now stationed at the counter, watched him with a mix of irritation and amusement. He leaned toward a younger staff member and murmured loud enough for others nearby to hear, "I don't know if he's lost or just confused. Maybe he thinks we're giving tours of the city's art scene." The staff member snickered, stealing a glance at the elderly man. "Should we call someone?" "I mean, this isn't exactly his kind of place," she whispered back, her voice tinged with mockery. A few nearby patrons caught the exchange and chuckled softly, their laughter mingling with the faint classical music playing in the background. The gallery owner, emboldened by the quiet approval, decided to escalate his performance. He straightened his tie and approached the elderly man, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. "Sir," he said with a practiced smile that barely concealed his disdain, "I couldn't help but notice your enthusiasm for our collection. It's always refreshing to see someone take such an interest in fine art." The elderly man looked up from the painting he was admiring, his expression calm. "Art speaks to everyone in different ways," he replied simply, his voice steady and unbothered. The gallery owner raised an eyebrow, surprised by the man's composed demeanor. "Indeed," he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Though I must admit, some of these pieces might be a bit sophisticated for most people. This particular artist's work, for instance, is quite avant-garde. It takes a certain refinement to truly appreciate it." The elderly man nodded, his gaze returning to the painting. "Refinement comes from understanding, not appearance," he said softly, almost to himself. The owner blinked, momentarily thrown off by the response, but quickly recovered. "Well," he said, his voice rising slightly, "perhaps you'd prefer something more mainstream. We have a few prints in the back that might suit your taste. They're very affordable." A ripple of laughter spread through the room as a few patrons nearby smirked. One woman in a designer dress whispered something to her companion, who glanced at the elderly man and laughed. The staff, taking their cue from the owner, joined in the mockery. One of them, a young man with a slick haircut, leaned against the counter and said loudly, "Maybe he's looking for a postcard. We should keep a few handy for people like him." Another staff member giggled. "Or a brochure. You know, something he can frame at home." The elderly man didn't flinch. He stood quietly, his eyes still fixed on the painting before him. His silence wasn't one of defeat but of resilience, a quiet strength that seemed to fill the space around him. Across the room, a young woman who had been watching the scene unfold felt a pang of discomfort. She wasn't part of the gallery's elite crowd, she had come as an aspiring artist, hoping to find inspiration in the works displayed. Unlike the others, she noticed the dignity with which the elderly man carried himself, even in the face of such blatant disrespect. The gallery owner, sensing an opportunity to further solidify his authority, leaned closer to the man and lowered his voice just enough to feign concern. "I'm sure you mean well," he said, his words dripping with insincerity, "but these pieces, they're not for everyone. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the public art exhibits downtown?" The elderly man turned to face the owner fully for the first time. His expression was calm but piercing, his eyes meeting the owner's with an intensity that silenced the room. For a moment, the air seemed to shift, the energy in the gallery growing heavy with unspoken tension. "I've seen many things in my life," the man said quietly, his voice steady. "Things far more complex and profound than anything on these walls. Art doesn't belong to the wealthy or the privileged. It belongs to anyone who can see it for what it truly is." The owner opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. The elderly man's words had struck a chord, though he would never admit it. The room was silent now, the laughter and whispers replaced by a palpable sense of unease. The young woman, still watching from across the room, felt her curiosity deepen. Who was this man? Why was he so unfazed by their ridicule? And what kind of life had he led to speak with such quiet authority? As the elderly man turned back to the painting, the gallery owner retreated, his confidence shaken. The staff exchanged awkward glances, unsure of how to proceed. And yet, the man remained as calm as ever, a quiet storm in the center of the room, leaving everyone to wonder what secrets lay behind his unassuming presence, the hidden treasure, the man's true identity. As the elderly man stood in front of the vibrant painting, lost in thought, the noise and judgment around him faded into the background. His mind began to drift, unraveling memories like pages in a well-worn book. The gallery, with its polished surfaces and pristine artwork, became a portal to another time, his time, a story few would ever imagine. A childhood of hardship and resilience. He had grown up in the Deep South, during an era when segregation dictated every facet of life. His family, hard-working sharecroppers, lived in a small, weather-beaten house surrounded by fields of cotton. Opportunities were scarce, and discrimination was an ever-present shadow. But even in those bleak circumstances, he had found beauty in the simplest things, a sunrise over the fields, the melodies of gospel choirs, and the crude sketches he would make in the dirt with a stick. His mother, a kind and determined woman, encouraged his creativity despite the hardships. She once saved enough to buy him a small sketchpad and a tin of crayons from a traveling salesman. That modest gift ignited his love for art. He would sit for hours, sketching the world as he saw it, raw, vibrant, and full of emotion. Art became his escape, a sanctuary where color and imagination erased the stark realities of inequality. The Vietnam War, a trial by fire. At 19, his life took a drastic turn. Drafted into the military during the Vietnam War, he found himself half a world away, thrust into the chaos of a jungle battlefield. The horrors of war tested his spirit in unimaginable ways. He lost comrades, endured grueling conditions, and carried the weight of decisions that no young man should ever have to make. Yet, even amid the bloodshed and turmoil, he found moments of humanity. In the downtime between missions, he would sketch in a battered notebook he kept in his pocket. The pages were filled with scenes of the jungle, portraits of his fellow soldiers, and abstract expressions of the emotions he couldn't put into words. His art became a lifeline, a way to process the pain and hold on to his sense of self in a world that sought to strip it away. When the war finally ended, he returned home to a country that was far from welcoming. The scars of combat were compounded by the harsh realities of racism and a society that often viewed veterans with suspicion or indifference. Yet, he refused to let bitterness consume him. He channeled his energy into rebuilding his life, guided by the lessons of resilience he had learned on the battlefield. Building a legacy, the art collector. In the years that followed, he worked tirelessly, starting with humble jobs, to make ends meet. Despite the long hours and modest pay, he never lost his passion for art. He began visiting local galleries, museums, and community art fairs whenever he could. Though he couldn't afford to buy much at first, he developed an eye for recognizing talent and potential in emerging artists. Over time, his circumstances improved. Through hard work and determination, he started a small business, a trucking company that he built from the ground up. The company thrived, and as his financial stability grew, so did his ability to invest in art. What started as a modest collection of pieces from local artists blossomed into something extraordinary. He developed relationships with artists and gallery owners across the country, often purchasing works that others overlooked. He believed in supporting underrepresented voices, particularly artists of color whose work spoke to the struggles and triumphs he understood so well. His collection became a reflection of his journey, diverse, bold, and deeply personal. A quiet wealth. By the time he retired, his collection had grown into one of considerable value, though few outside the art world knew of it. He never sought fame or recognition. For him, the art was enough. It adorned the walls of his home, each piece telling a story, each frame holding a memory. He would often sit in his study, surrounded by the vibrant canvases, and reflect on how far he had come. From the dirt roads of his childhood to the jungles of Vietnam, and finally to the quiet success of his later years, his life had been a tapestry of hardship and triumph. The gallery encounter, present day. As he stood in the gallery now, staring at the bold colors and intricate details of the painting before him, he felt a sense of connection. The piece spoke to him, much like the works in his own collection. But the people around him, judging him by his worn clothes and weathered face, would never guess the life he had lived or the treasures he had amassed. The gallery owner, smug in his ignorance, saw only an elderly man who didn't belong. The staff, echoing their leader, treated him like an outsider. Yet the elderly man remained composed, his calm exterior hiding the depths of his experience. The onlooker, the young artist who had been watching from a distance, felt a deepening sense of curiosity. There was something about this man, something that didn't match the dismissive narrative being spun around him. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he studied the art with an intensity that spoke of understanding and appreciation. Little did the gallery owner or the staff realize that the man they were mocking had a collection worth millions, built not from privilege, but from perseverance and passion. He was not just a patron of the arts, he was a living testament to the transformative power of resilience, a hidden treasure in their midst. And soon, they would learn exactly who they had underestimated. The elderly man stood silently before a large, abstract painting that dominated the gallery wall. It was a cacophony of bold colors and sweeping strokes that seemed to pulse with energy, as if the artist had poured their soul onto the canvas. He leaned forward slightly, studying the details with a discerning eye, his weathered fingers tracing the air as though he could feel the texture of the paint. The gallery owner, watching from a distance, couldn't help but roll his eyes. He had indulged this visitor long enough. His patience was wearing thin, and the presence of the man, so out of place among the tailored suits and designer dresses, was becoming an embarrassment. With a sigh of exaggerated exasperation, he crossed the room, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. "Sir," the owner began, his tone laced with feigned politeness, "I see you're quite captivated by this piece. It's one of our finest works, created by a highly sought-after artist. In fact, it recently sold for a record price." The elderly man glanced at him, his face calm and unreadable. "It's a striking piece," he said quietly. "The use of color reminds me of a canvas I acquired a few years ago, similar energy, though the brushwork was more intricate." The owner blinked, momentarily taken aback. He recovered quickly, letting out a small chuckle. "Acquired, you say? From where, if I might ask?" The man smiled faintly, a hint of amusement playing at the corners of his lips. "Oh, here and there," he replied. "I've been collecting for decades. Some pieces from private auctions, others directly from the artists themselves." The gallery owner tilted his head, his expression a mix of skepticism and curiosity. "Is that so?" he said, unable to keep the condescension from creeping into his voice. "And what sort of collection do you have, if you don't mind me asking?" The elderly man turned his gaze back to the painting. "A little bit of everything," he said. "Abstracts, impressionists, contemporary pieces. My collection includes works by Jones, Patel, and even a few from the early career of Celeste Armstrong." The room seemed to hold its breath. The names he had mentioned were not just artists, they were luminaries in the art world, creators whose works commanded millions at auctions. Several patrons nearby, who had been pretending not to eavesdrop, suddenly looked over, their eyes widening. The owner's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of disbelief. "Celeste Armstrong?" he repeated. "You own pieces by her?" Well, she's practically a legend." The elderly man nodded thoughtfully. "She is. I bought one of her first major works, directly from her studio. I remember she was surprised anyone appreciated it at the time. Now, it's one of the centerpieces of my collection." A hushed murmur spread through the gallery as more people began to listen. The young artist who had been watching from across the room felt her heart race. Who was this man? How could someone so unassuming possess a collection of such magnitude? The gallery owner struggled to maintain his composure. "Well, that's quite remarkable," he said, though his tone betrayed his doubt. "Surely, if what you're saying is true, you must be a seasoned collector." The elderly man finally turned to face him fully, his eyes calm but piercing. "I suppose you could say that," he said evenly. "In fact, I purchased works from this very gallery before. Several, actually." The room fell into an uneasy silence. The staff exchanged nervous glances, their earlier mockery now a source of deep discomfort. The owner, visibly flustered, forced a smile. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice tightening. "Forgive me, but I don't recall your name." The elderly man reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a neatly folded business card. He handed it to the owner, who took it with slightly trembling fingers. As the owner's eyes scanned the card, his face turned an ashen shade of pale. The name on the card was one he recognized immediately. It belonged to a private collector whose reputation was legendary in the art world, a man known for his impeccable taste and the staggering value of his acquisitions. This was no ordinary visitor. This was a buyer whose purchases had directly influenced the careers of numerous artists and the fortunes of galleries worldwide. The owner's mouth opened, but no words came out. The staff, who had been watching from behind the counter, looked on in stunned silence. The room, once filled with whispered judgments and quiet laughter, now buzzed with an entirely different energy, a mix of shock, awe, and an undercurrent of guilt. The elderly man gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "I've always believed that art should speak for itself," he said. "It doesn't matter who you are or what you look like. What matters is what you see and feel when you stand in front of it." With that, he turned back to the painting, leaving the gallery owner and staff to wrestle with the weight of their assumptions. The young artist, still watching from the corner, felt a surge of admiration for the man who had so effortlessly dismantled the prejudice around him. The truth was out, and the shift in perception was undeniable. The man they had mocked and dismissed wasn't just a visitor, he was a patron of the arts, a connoisseur whose legacy would far outlast their fleeting judgments. The elderly man stood quietly for a moment, his gaze lingering on the bold painting before him. The vibrant swirls of color seemed to mirror the unspoken energy now filling the room. The gallery had gone silent, an uneasy stillness that clung to the air as patrons and staff alike tried to process the revelation of his identity. The gallery owner, still clutching the man's business card, struggled to regain his composure. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the image of the humble man before him with the reputation of the esteemed collector he now knew him to be. Beads of sweat formed along his hairline as he realized the magnitude of his earlier behavior. The elderly man turned to face the owner, his expression calm and unbothered, as if entirely unaware, or unconcerned, by the tension in the room. "I'd like to make a few purchases," he said, his voice steady but firm. The owner blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Why yes, of course," he stammered. "What pieces were you interested in?" The man gestured toward the painting he had been studying. "I'll start with this one," he said. "The energy in it speaks to me." The owner's jaw tightened as he fought to suppress the urge to blurt out the price. He had made a spectacle of emphasizing the painting's value earlier, certain it would intimidate the man into leaving. Now, he was acutely aware of how foolish that had been. "That's an excellent choice," the owner said, his voice faltering slightly. "It's priced at $120,000. The elderly man nodded without hesitation. "I'll take it," he said simply. A murmur rippled through the gallery as patrons exchanged astonished glances. The staff, who had spent the better part of the afternoon mocking the man, now stood frozen behind the counter, their faces pale and expressionless. The owner, still reeling, tried to maintain a professional demeanor. "Of course," he said, fumbling with his tablet to process the sale. "Is there anything else that caught your eye?" The man walked slowly around the gallery, pausing thoughtfully at several other pieces. With each step, the room seemed to grow heavier with anticipation. Every patron, every staff member, hung on his movements, their earlier arrogance replaced by a mix of awe and discomfort. At last, he stopped before a series of smaller paintings, abstract landscapes that captured the interplay of light and shadow with remarkable subtlety. "These three," he said, pointing to the set. "They remind me of home." The owner cleared his throat. A fine choice, he said. They're part of a limited collection by a rising artist. The set is priced at $85,000. I'll take them as well, the man replied, his tone as casual as if he were ordering coffee. By now, the gallery staff could barely conceal their shock. The young man who had mocked the visitor earlier looked down at the floor, unable to meet his gaze. The woman who had joked about selling postcards fidgeted nervously, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. The elderly man continued his tour of the gallery, selecting piece after piece with the same quiet confidence. A bold sculpture in the corner caught his eye, its sharp lines and innovative design drawing him in. This one too, he said. That's a one-of-a-kind piece, the owner said, his voice trembling slightly. It's priced at $250,000. The man nodded. It'll pair well with a piece I already own. Add it to the list. By the time he had finished, the total exceeded $1.2 million. The gallery owner, struggling to hide his amazement, began finalizing the transaction. We'll, arrange for delivery immediately, he said, his voice now dripping with deference. Of course, we can provide white glove service to ensure everything arrives safely. The elderly man smiled faintly. I'm sure you will, he said. I've always appreciated your gallery's professionalism. The irony of his words was not lost on anyone in the room. The owner winced, realizing how those earlier moments of dismissal and mockery now stood in stark contrast to the man's quiet grace. He glanced at his staff, silently willing them to avoid eye contact with the patron. As the elderly man returned to the counter to finalize the details, the young artist who had been watching stepped forward hesitantly. Excuse me, she said softly. I couldn't help but notice how you spoke about the pieces. You have such an incredible eye for art. Are you a collector? As the elderly man made his way toward the gallery's exit, the air was heavy with a mix of astonishment and unease. Every eye in the room was on him now, but not with the mocking stares that had greeted him earlier. This time, there was an almost reverent curiosity, as though the weight of his presence had finally been understood. The gallery owner, who had been watching him with increasing discomfort, stepped forward, his polished confidence replaced by an unfamiliar awkwardness. Sir, he began hesitantly, his voice betraying the internal conflict between his ego and the realization of his misjudgment. Before you leave, may I speak with you for a moment? The elderly man paused, turning back to face him. His expression remained calm, devoid of any smugness or anger. Of course, he said simply. The owner hesitated, fumbling for the right words. I owe you an apology, he said, his tone faltering. I misjudged you. I made assumptions I had no right to make. It was wrong of me. The man studied him for a moment, his eyes steady but kind. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, he said, his voice carrying the weight of years. But words mean little if they're not followed by change. The owner swallowed hard, nodding. You're absolutely right, he said. And I assure you, this experience has taught me a great deal. The room remained silent, the tension palpable as patrons and staff listened intently. The elderly man took a step closer, his posture upright yet relaxed. I've learned a few lessons myself over the years, he said, his tone soft but commanding. Would you like to hear one? The owner nodded eagerly, as did a few others in the room who couldn't help but lean in closer. The man took a deep breath, his gaze distant as if looking back through the corridors of time. Life has a way of humbling us, he began. I grew up in a world where people judged you by the color of your skin, by the clothes you wore, or the way you spoke. I learned early on that respect wasn't something freely given, it was something you had to fight for. He paused, his voice growing quieter but no less powerful. When I was 19, I was drafted into the Vietnam War. I didn't have a choice, but I went because it was my duty. I faced things over there that no one should ever have to face. I saw men who were brave, men who were scared, and men who were cruel. But what struck me most was how war stripped everyone bare. It didn't matter where you came from, how much money you had, or the color of your skin. In the jungle, we were all just human beings trying to survive. The gallery was utterly still, every person captivated by his words. Even the staff who had earlier mocked him now looked on with wide eyes, their faces etched with shame and awe. The war taught me that you can't judge a person by what you see on the surface, the man continued. It's what's inside that matters. Courage, kindness, integrity, those are the things that define a person. And those are things you can't see if you're too busy looking down on someone. He turned his gaze to the gallery owner, his expression softening. When I came back from the war, I carried those lessons with me. I worked hard, built a life, and surrounded myself with things that reminded me of the beauty in the world, art being one of them. It's helped me see the world not just as it is, but as it could be. The owner's face was flushed now, his earlier arrogance replaced by visible remorse. I don't know what to say, he admitted. I let my own biases blind me, and I disrespected you. I'm so sorry. The elderly man gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. We're all human, he said. We all make mistakes. The question is, what do we do once we realize we were wrong? He glanced around the room, his eyes meeting those of the patrons and staff who had stood silently by, complicit in their own way. Every person you meet has a story, he said. Some are written in ink, bold and clear. Others are written in scars, hidden beneath the surface. If you take the time to listen, you might find that their story has something to teach you. The young artist, who had been watching quietly from the corner, felt a lump rise in her throat. She had never heard anyone speak with such quiet conviction, and she suddenly understood why this man carried himself with such calm dignity. He wasn't just a collector of art, he was a collector of life's lessons. The gallery owner stepped forward, his voice trembling. Thank you, he said, his words heavy with sincerity. Thank you for sharing that. I promise you, I'll do better. The elderly man nodded, a glimmer of approval in his eyes. That's all anyone can ask, he said. And remember, respect costs nothing, but is worth everything. With that, he tipped his cap once more and turned to leave, his footsteps echoing softly as he walked out of the gallery. The room remained silent long after he had gone, each person lost in their own thoughts, reflecting on the wisdom he had imparted. For the gallery owner, the encounter was a turning point, a moment of reckoning that would stay with him for the rest of his life. For the staff and patrons, it was a humbling reminder of the power of humility and the danger of assumptions. And for the young artist, it was an inspiration, a living example of the grace and strength that comes from a life well lived. The elderly man's words hung in the air long after he had left, a quiet testament to the enduring impact of wisdom, respect, and the unyielding power of humanity, redemption and respect, the final lesson. The gallery was still, as though frozen in time. The echoes of the elderly man's parting words lingered in the air, pressing heavily on the hearts of those who had witnessed the day's events. The room, once filled with quiet laughter and whispers of ridicule, now carried an almost sacred silence. The gallery owner stood motionless, staring at the door through which the man had just exited. In his hands, he still held the business card, the name embossed on it shining faintly under the gallery's soft lighting. He turned it over as if it might reveal something more, something to lessen the weight of his guilt. But there was nothing more to learn from the card, only from his actions moving forward. Finally, he let out a long, shaky breath and turned to his staff, who were standing behind the counter, their faces pale and full of unease. Gather around, he said, his voice soft but firm. The staff exchanged uncertain glances, before stepping closer. They could sense the gravity of the moment, and none of them dared to speak. The young man who had made the joke about postcards looked down at his shoes, unable to meet his boss's gaze. The woman who had giggled nervously at his earlier comments now stood with her arms crossed, as though trying to shield herself from the weight of her own embarrassment. The gallery owner cleared his throat, his voice trembling slightly. What happened today, what we allowed to happen, was unacceptable, he said. We judged a man, a great man, on nothing more than his appearance. We mocked him, dismissed him, and treated him as if he didn't belong here. He paused, his eyes scanning their faces. But the truth is, he belongs here far more than any of us. The staff nodded slowly, shame written across their faces. The owner looked toward the young artist who had been a quiet observer throughout the ordeal. You, he said, his tone softening. You were the only one who looked at him with curiosity instead of judgment. You saw something in him that the rest of us were too blind to see. And for that, I thank you. The young artist blushed and shook her head. I didn't do anything, she said quietly. He just carried himself in a way that made me want to know more. I think we all should have seen it. The owner nodded. You're right. And it's my job to make sure this never happens again. He turned back to his staff, his voice gaining strength. From this day forward, this gallery will be a place of respect. Not just for the wealthy or the well-dressed, but for anyone who walks through those doors. Because art isn't about exclusivity, it's about connection. And we failed to honor that today. The staff murmured their agreement, their earlier arrogance replaced by humility. Suddenly, the gallery owner straightened his jacket and turned toward the door. I'm going to find him, he said firmly. He deserves a proper apology, one given with sincerity, not just words. A heartfelt apology. Outside, the elderly man was walking slowly down the cobblestone street, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow around him. He carried himself with the same quiet dignity he had displayed all day, unbothered by the events that had unfolded in the gallery. Sir. Please, wait. The owner's voice broke through the hum of the street. The elderly man paused and turned, his expression curious but calm. The gallery owner hurried to catch up, his breath slightly labored. When he reached the man, he straightened himself and looked him in the eye. I need to apologize, he said, his voice steady but laden with emotion. Not just for the way I treated you, but for the example I set for my staff. I was arrogant, blind, and completely wrong. And for that, I am deeply, truly sorry. The elderly man studied him for a moment, his gaze penetrating but kind. An apology is the first step, he said, his tone measured. The second step is making sure it doesn't happen again. The owner nodded earnestly. It won't. I promise you, it won't. A staff's redemption. When the elderly man returned to the gallery, led by the owner, he was met with an unexpected sight. The staff stood in a line, their faces solemn but determined. The young man who had made the postcard comment stepped forward first. I was wrong to mock you, he said, his voice shaking slightly. It was cruel, and I'm sorry. You deserve better. The others followed, each offering their apologies. Their words were humble and heartfelt, and though the elderly man could see their shame, he also saw their sincerity. You all have learned a valuable lesson today, he said, addressing them. And if you carry it with you, it will make you better people, not just in your work, but in your lives. A vow to change. Before leaving the gallery, the elderly man turned to the owner one last time. You have the opportunity to create a space where art truly belongs to everyone, he said. Don't waste it. The owner nodded, his eyes glistening. I won't, he said. Thank you for your patience, your grace, and your wisdom. I'll never forget this. The final farewell. As the elderly man left the gallery for the final time, the staff and patrons watched him go, their hearts and minds forever changed. He had come to their space as an outsider, judged and underestimated. But he left as a teacher, a man whose quiet strength and profound wisdom had left an indelible mark on them all. For the gallery owner, it was more than a lesson, it was a transformation. From that day forward, the gallery became a place of openness and respect, a testament to the man who had reminded them all of the true value of humanity and the art of seeing beyond the surface.